Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, What does a life cycle approach applied to address marine litter and plastic pollution look like? Organized by the United Nations Environment Programme, or UNEP. My name is Tessa Gogerse, and I'm the head of the Pollution-Free Ecosystems unit of UNEP, in which we look at pollution issues from source to sea. It's my pleasure to moderate today's event, but before we dive into the program with our first speakers, I would like to offer some opening remarks on behalf of UNEP. Over the past decades, we've seen an exponential growth in plastic production and unfortunately also a dramatic increase in the plastic waste streams, much of which end up in landfill or in the environment. This is not only a regrettable loss of a resource, but plastics in the environment will also inevitably impact ecosystems, human health, economies, and social well-being. The science is clear on the need to tackle plastic pollution. Through the United Nations Environment Assembly resolutions and the ad hoc open-ended expert group on marine litter and microplastics, the urgency of the matter has been recognized. And momentum is building for global action to address the issue of marine litter and plastic pollution. There are currently multiple country-driven informal processes that aim to keep the topic high on the agenda towards the resumed 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly in 2022. These include the Ministerial Conference on Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution to be held on the 1st and 2nd of September, co-convened by the governments of Ecuador, Germany, Ghana and Vietnam, the New York Group of Friends to combat marine plastic litter, and the Nairobi Group of Friends to combat marine litter and plastic pollution. And tomorrow, the online forum on the multi-stakeholder platform on marine litter and microplastics will take place, organized by Japan. In the context of the conclusions of the ad hoc open-ended expert group, and also recognized by many during the pre-meetings of the Ministerial Conference, downstream solutions are not enough to solve the plastic pollution crisis. We need to look upstream and consider actions across the whole life cycle of plastics and plastics products. Only then can we enable a systemic shift to sustainable consumption and production patterns and to circular approaches. Such actions will need to involve all actors, from governments to industry to consumers, and need to be designed in such a way that those products and business models that are less harmful to the environment and the economy benefits most from economic drivers and not the other way around. We need coordinated actions by all these actors in whatever shape we agree to collaborate. Governments have a role to play in regulating and providing the enabling environment. Industry must commit to work towards more responsible use of plastics and other resources. We need informed consumers that are aware of the consequences of their actions and act upon these. And we need trade agreements that consider the capacity of countries to deal with imported plastics and waste. During the first pre-meeting of the Ministerial Conference in May this year, UNEP was requested to share its technical expertise and provide insights into what a life cycle approach means in the context of addressing plastic pollution. Today's event is our initial answer to this request. The webinar is being recorded and the presentations will be provided online on the website that has been communicated to all of you and that my colleagues will also share on screen and through the chat. We will keep on updating the website with useful resources to enhance the understanding and facilitate the implementation of a life cycle approach to plastic pollution. We will now start with a presentation by my colleague Jorens on what a life cycle approach to address marine litter and plastic pollution looks like. His presentation will be complemented by Gerald Naber, our partner from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and their presentations will be followed by a short intervention by respectively a member state, a multi-stakeholder organization, and an industry representative. We are very pleased that they are all with us here today to share their experiences, challenges, and their lessons learned in applying a life cycle approach to addressing plastic pollution. After their interventions, we will open for questions and answers, and we hope to address as many of your questions and comments as possible. Please do not hesitate to share them already during the presentations in the Q&A box so that our backstage team can receive them and have them ready to be shared. Finally, to close the event, I will hand over to my colleague Elisa Tonda, Head of the Consumption and Production Unit in UNEP, who will provide some concluding remarks. As we have only 90 minutes and a great lineup of speakers, allow me to invite Jorens Mila-Canal, Head of UNEP's Lifecycle Work and the Lifecycle Initiative Secretariat, to provide UNEP's perspective on a lifecycle approach applied to addressing plastic pollution. Jorens, the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks, Tessa, for your kind introduction, and good day, everybody. I will be joined later, as Tessa was mentioning, by Gerald Neighbor from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and I would like also to acknowledge my other colleagues from the Life Cycle Initiative, as well as UNEP's Consumption and Production Unit for their valuable contributions to this presentation. So first, allow me to very briefly introduce you to the Life Cycle Initiative as a key partnership hosted by UNEP that channels a lot of our external looking work on life cycle assessment and life cycle approaches more generally, in order to enable the use of these approaches in key public and private decision making. The vision for UNEP's life cycle work is that we can contribute to achieving the relevant goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals, faster and more efficiently by targeting the key drivers of environmental impacts and other types of impacts, as well as addressing potential trade-offs with this life cycle approach. To do this, the Life Cycle Initiative and the Life Cycle work in UNEP delivers the work in three main areas. As you can see on your screens, in this area in blue, through technical and policy advice, we are helping to mainstream the use of life cycle approaches and life cycle thinking into global areas of decision and policy making for sustainable development, showing positive impacts towards the achievement of global agenda goals, mainly through partnerships. In order to achieve this, we also work on capacity development, on the ways that life cycle knowledge can be best used in enhancing the effectiveness of decisions and policies towards sustainable development, and obviously also in enhancing the availability and access to life cycle assessment databases, impact assessment methods, and making sure that these are all interoperable. So moving also to a bit more of the context of why we are promoting this life cycle approach and how this approach has been requested in various international fora, we can start, well, on the strategic approach to international chemicals management, the SICHAM, where a request to work on life cycle management of chemicals in products was requested, and this was later captured as well in the Sustainable Development Goal 12 on responsible consumption and production, which also requests the sound management of chemicals and waste across their life cycle. We have more recently seen several of the UNEA resolutions, the United Nations Environment Assembly resolutions, and here I will only cite a few in the UNEA 4 of 2019. The first resolution on innovative pathways towards sustainable consumption and production acknowledges that the use of life cycle approaches helps to ensure resource efficiency and reduced environmental impacts. Or the resolution in UNEA 4, Resolution 9 on addressing single-use plastic products pollution, which also encouraged all actors to promote sound management of plastics across their life cycle. And most recently, as you all know, in the context of the Ministerial Conference on Marine Litter and Plastic Production, which, as mentioned by Tessa, will take place in September, there was this request for UNEP to deliver a webinar on what we can understand of the life cycle approach of plastics applied to plastics pollution. So of course, this is us today. So let's quickly move and focus on the matter at hand, and let's begin with what a life cycle is. And I guess most of you already know, but let me say, or the official definition of what life cycle is, which is captured in the ISO standard 14040. It says that the life cycle of any product are the consecutive stages for the product to deliver its service, product understood also as a good or a service. From the raw material acquisition and processing through manufacture, distribution, the use and maintenance of the product or good, to the final disposal at the end of use or at the end of life. This disposal may also involve recycling of the materials or reuse of the same product. And here, of course, we would see it for plastics, starting probably from the extraction of oil and gas, and then its processing, manufacturing into products, and so on and so forth, until we get to either recycling or reuse, or the final disposal in terms of landfilling, incineration, or unfortunately very often ending up in the environment. And of course, when talking of plastics, there's not much of a cycle that we can talk. It's rather a linear system. So we talk of life cycle because ideally in nature we see a lot of cycles happening, and the waste or the end of a being becoming the beginning of another being. In the case of plastics, we see that this is mainly, we could say, a live arrow, because it seems to be quite unidirectional. This figure is one of the most cited references on what we know about the global flows of plastics, and as you can see from the annual production, we see that the vast majority is being discarded in landfills, incineration, or the environment. And there's this very small fraction that you can see in this loop here, which has been or is being recycled. So to be clear of what we're talking about today, in a life cycle approach, we focus on identifying the key hotspots or the drivers for impact on all possible environmental and socioeconomic impacts. And we look at those impacts that are caused by any goods or services, such as plastic products and their alternatives. And we look across the whole life cycle. So in all of these life cycle stages, as we saw before. With this knowledge of the key hotspots, the life cycle approach can orient the selection of the best solutions overall, the best solutions for the environment, society, and the economy, while identifying and helping to address the potential trade-offs between these different areas of interest. So this is what could be a good definition of a life cycle approach. In UNEP, we have been using this life cycle approach in a broader sense to inform decisions when addressing value chains. And here, the life cycle approach is considered in several of the stages in this value chain approach that you see on your screens, where we also consider broader actors that also influence or that touch upon the life cycle of goods and services. So actors such as governments and financiers, researchers. We consider all these approaches and all these actors in order to identify the hotspots, but also the possible solutions across the life cycle. And across the life cycle, we mean solutions upstream, midstream, where we're mainly using the products, and downstream, when the products get to the end of their use. And we not only consider the hotspots and the solutions, but also the actors that can most effectively implement those actions. So a key step in the value chain approach is to coordinate the actors. So as we saw, knowing first the key hotspots and identifying solutions, but then also coordinating the actors in the way that they implement the solutions, and then prioritizing those actions that drive the most change, and finally work towards reaching common goals. So we will be driving into some of the specific examples that have been used already in this area in UNEP, and we will see that in the case of plastics, the UNEP, together with the Life Cycle Initiative and the IUCN, generated this national guidance to identify plastic pollution hotspots and to guide actions towards resolving them. In this guidance, the user is guided on the collection of necessary data to quantify the main plastic flows in the economy in terms of the key polymers that are being used in the economy, the types of products that are being used, the industries that are using them, which are the key actors, the sectors. And then with this data on the hotspots, we can determine the potential impact sources and those spots geographically on the map, that are being the main drivers of plastic pollution. Following the identification of the hotspots, the guidance facilitates the identification of possible interventions and instruments that are more adequate for that for the country that is considering this. And then to do this, we combine a set of preset, a menu of options with those solutions that are identified by the users of the guidance. I want to insist that the guidance is particularly useful at structuring the available data that are in the country and identifying the data gaps that will allow the adequate management of the plastic pollution crisis, while providing guidance about how to bridge these gaps. We often find a lack of data as one of the key hurdles. The guidance is available, as you can see on the top of your screens in this website. And it has already been applied in several countries, and we have been generating reports with key information, such as the information shown in your graphs, in terms of what's happening with plastic. I mean, the percentage that is being mismanaged, the percentage that has been collected, what is collected for recycling or recycled effectively in the country. It identifies specific polymers, product types, etc., and then it ends up with identifying the actionable hotspots and the potential interventions with a biggest potential for solving the problem. So as you can see also in this map, we have already been applying this guidance in several countries, and more are coming to the list. In kind of the following step, once we've identified the hotspots, it is important to identify solutions that are holistic and that can work across the life cycle. Therefore, because these hotspots occur across the life cycle of plastic products, we must look at the whole life cycle as well in terms of identifying solutions. So when we start from the beginning, as mentioned, at the cradle of the life cycle, we have to start looking at solutions that stop the subsidies and investments into new virgin plastic production, because this is one of the key problems that we're identifying, that there's so much plastic being produced and so much plastic being coming into the economy that it's very hard to deal with it. So this is a first level of solutions. By stopping or by reducing this arrow here in red, we can achieve that through increasing recycled content, so ensuring that the plastic that is already in the economy can be used at least more than once. Of course, for all of these, design is of paramount importance to ensure that the products are made in a way that they will be staying in the economy without toxic additives, for instance, that would hamper their use and recycling further down the life cycle. And of course, we have solutions that affect more or less the whole life cycle. I mean, how the finance is flowing to the types of solutions that are helping, rather than financing the types of processes which are creating the problem. But then solutions like eco-innovation or procurement, sustainable procurement, both public but also private procurement, information provided through eco-labels and other types of consumer information, the standards to share the information. So we see that there are certainly a lot of solutions which will influence the whole life cycle of the product. And we also see instruments that are commonly used, and we will see some examples today, such as the extended producer responsibility, where we can be influencing both the collection of finance to secure, to ensure that the end of life is properly financed. But through the design of this extended producer responsibility, we can also be influencing the design of products, so they are better off to begin with. So the publication that you see here on your screens is where you have a lot of details about these and other solutions. These are obviously not comprehensive, but already a good start of the kind of solutions and the kinds of actors that we can be focusing on. In assessing the most sustainable solutions, we need to use life cycle assessment studies. This is very important, and I want to address or to remind everybody that life cycle assessment is a standardized way to assess the environmental impacts of products and services across their life cycle. The fact that this is standardized is important to enable fair comparisons between these products. And in response to the UNEA for Resolution 9, UNEP, with the support of the Life Cycle Initiative, has been pulling together meta-analysis of LCA studies that compare single-use plastic products with their alternatives. And this included also a series of webinars last October. You can find all of these materials for the different products that you see in this timeline in the website on top of your screens, which we will see also in the next slides. We will just stop here to explain a little bit the kinds of results that we find with these studies. As mentioned, many of them are already in the website, available for downloading. You can see this list of the ones that are already available. So for shopping bags, bottles, takeaway food packaging, caps, etc. And there are many more, well, some more studies coming shortly. I would like also to acknowledge here the contribution from IVL in Sweden and TGH Think Space in South Africa, who have been our knowledge partners as well in this process. Now, we will see in this graphic just one of the examples of the kind of information that we're getting from this life cycle assessment meta-analysis, the one specifically on beverage caps, as you see here. And I would just like to extract that the graph is extracting the key parameters that influence the results of the LCA studies. Importantly, we see in this column the behavior of consumers. So we see on the one hand what a potentially eco or cost-conscious consumer could behave, and maybe consumers which are a bit more indifferent, because the way in which a consumer acts influences the results heavily. And on the rows, we see also the different types of waste management technologies which are available in the country. And it's important to see that the results are usually favorable to the reusable caps, which are represented by this blue shade. So in most of the cells, most of these combinations are favorable for reusable caps. Reusable caps have less environmental impacts, with the exception of when reusable caps are not reused enough. Of course, if we design a product to be reused and it's only used once or twice, then its impacts are actually worse for the environment. But if the product is properly reused, it can fulfill its function in a much more efficient way. So in some reusable caps, we've seen, for instance, that once they've been in use for maybe a couple of months, they already have a lower environmental footprint than the single-use plastic version. Of course, the results also depend on the type of waste management that is available in the country, as well as the main technologies for generating electricity or other aspects like that. So we have similar studies, as mentioned, for other types of products, and you can find them in the website. I would just like to highlight that the conclusions are relatively consistent in that reusable options outperform the single-use ones, as long as they are effectively and efficiently reused. And of course, with the effect of local conditions and consumer behavior, which is also very important to consider. Moving on, because we're short of time, but just to highlight also that as requested by the resolution 4/9, we have also pulled together the results of all the several LCA meta-analyses, as well as the experiences of member states in applying a life cycle approach to addressing single-use plastic products pollution in the synthesis report that you see on your screens. And again, I will insist once more that the key conclusion is that it is mainly the single-use nature of any product which is more the problem rather than the type of material. And therefore, policymakers are encouraged to favor reusable products over single-use ones. So reusable, refillable systems. This is important to keep resources at their highest value within the economy. And of course, the importance of taking this life cycle approach and considering the impacts across the life cycle is important and highlighted. The report also goes to some length to extract other policy relevant messages, as you can see here. Of course, important to consider the context in which the products are used. This is always very important, and it's also explained in the report on how we can do that. considering like the acceptability of different product types, the behavior of users, the energy and waste management infrastructure, as I mentioned, and also the extent to which real costs are actually already incorporated into the cost structure. These are some of the very important elements. So now, closing on this initial part of the presentation, the key message is that we need a systems change. We really need to shift the paradigm of the take, make, and then dispose economy into an economy that keeps resources for longer in the economy and at highest value. All of this requires a life cycle approach. To ensure that plastic never becomes waste, we must tackle plastic production at its source, moving away, as mentioned, from this linear economy into a more circular economy, rethinking the way in which we design, use, and reuse plastic products. In a circular economy for plastic, as we will see more now, plastic, problematic and unnecessary plastic products are designed out. New business models that transform the way in which plastics are used and the plastics are safely reused, recycled, or composted. That's things that we need to ensure. We obviously need to communicate this to all actors across the value chain, and always base the decisions on science-based observations. Monitoring the effectiveness of policy as well is extremely important. Given the global nature of the plastics value chain, it is really important and clear that we need adequate coordination across local, national, regional, and international approaches. And we will see it as well in the rest of the interventions today. And just to iterate once more, that a key conclusion is that it's often the single-use nature of the disposable economy, the take, make, waste model, which is wrong, rather than specific materials. Also important to note that we have a lot of information and resources to get us going, so we need to implement this type of policies and act more decisively. So moving on now through the steps of the value chain approach, we have seen a lot of examples in the several stages. We will now move into a specific example where we have been implementing particularly these last three steps of coordinating, prioritizing actions, and reaching common goals and reporting them. Where we have been identifying these solutions and promoting actions among the multiple stakeholders that form the plastics value chain. These most important actions have been prioritized and coordinated, and in order to achieve specific targets in a global agenda. I am talking of the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment, which is led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in collaboration with UNEP. And to talk about it, I have the pleasure to introduce Gerald Naber, who leads the implementation of the global commitment from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So, Gerald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jorens. Thank you for this, and a pleasure to be part of this today. And hello to everyone who's listening and viewing this. I'm very pleased to speak a little bit to the results we've done, or the setup of the global commitment that we've been working at for a couple of years together, indeed, with UNEP. So yeah, if you could go to the first slide, there you would see my first presentation in the three initiatives that we've set up that we've built on top of this one common vision of a circular economy for plastics. And I think that's quite important to stress that when we started as a new plastics economy team at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that was one of the first things we did. We looked into, okay, what is the vision of a circular economy and how can we make this an effective solution that everybody in the value chain, from the plastic producers all the way to the governments and everything in between, supports and addresses and recognizes as a solution going forward. So we started in 2018, and this common vision that we launched now using these initiatives currently now has more than 1,000 organizations supported it, recognizing this is a vision that can work, can be a solution, and connecting themselves to the targets specifically for their position in the value chain. So I want to talk a little bit about these three initiatives, in particular the global commitment, which I'll be using for the rest of the presentation. So the global commitment itself, we keep it on the slide if you mind, Jorns. Thanks. So the global commitment was launched in 2018 together with UNEP, and with now more than 500 signatories, which includes the largest packaging producers like the beverage brands and the supermarkets, cosmetic companies, all the way to petrochemicals, and also governments. This has become a global reference point on tackling plastic pollution, that has been quite successful in that sense, and I'll talk a bit more in a minute. The Plastic Pacts, where we launched at the same time, saying that we wanted to start a network of plastic pacts, meaning regional or national implementation vehicles, again, cross-value, public-private collaboration, to really address the same vision, but make it happen and making a reality on the local and national scale. Currently, there are 9 national pacts in the network, as well as 2 regional pacts. So we have seen a tremendous growth in it, and we've also seen a huge amount of organizations and NGOs, governments coming together and understanding the vision, and again implement that on a local, national level, and setting targets again against that to establish it. So that's been very, very positive and fruitful to see. And lastly, last initiative I wanted to mention here is the Global Tourism Plastic Initiative that was started by UNEP together with UNWTO, supported by us, which is the interface of the global commitment, but then specifically for the tourism and the hospitality sector. So again, the same vision, same 2025 targets, but really catered to the needs of that sector to build back better and address plastic pollution in there. So those are the 3 initiatives I wanted to mention quickly. And now let's have a quicker look, or a more special look, at the global commitment indeed. And there are 4 core elements to what we have learned to run such a public-private cross-value chain initiative. It's the common definitions, the common targets, the annual reporting, so the transparency, and then raise the bar. So what do these mean? The first element, the common definition, is really to create a common understanding of what is, in this case, recyclability, what is reuse, what is a plastic packaging, compostability. And when I think back at the early days of the global movement, this has been a huge impact in just bringing plastic packaging producers, recyclers, they all of a sudden started understanding what they were talking about in the same manner, and really going to address, okay, this is now a challenge we can address collectively. That's been hugely impactful. Then on top of that, delivering the vision, you need targets, you need to set a roadmap how you want to get there. So we work, against the 2025 timeline. We're not, of course, not expecting that the circular economy for plastic packaging has been realized in about 5 years from now, but it's a great milestone to measure where we have come to, and understanding if the targets we've set are delivered on, and if we collectively have moved closer towards this vision. And that's immediately the third point I wanted to mention. Annual reporting is critical here. So giving the transparency to the value chain themselves, so all the actors, the suppliers, the buyers know what they are doing, but of course also the civil society, governments also know where interventions are needed. Investors need to now know where more investments and where support is needed. So that is a critical element to it, of course. And the last point here is raising the bar means what we have integrated that into these initiatives I mentioned before. It's an inherent mechanism to be able to set new requirements and to raise that bar, because you start from a certain element, but you of course want to move and make progress. And the minute you do that, you also see that you need to maybe adjust your ambition level, adjust the targets. So that's an element, a quite important element of those initiatives that we're actually currently trying to make effective and see how we can improve the initiative being even more impactful and successful in delivering on the vision. So I spoke about the vision. What is this vision? Next slide. There are 3 types of action. That was one to, yeah, exactly. Thank you. 3 types of action fitting, of course, within the position of an actor in the value chain, or maybe even the responsibility that they carry, that they can take on to build this circular economy for plastics. That is eliminate, innovate, and circulate. I mean, it's a bit of it's a simplification, but it really captures nicely the vision. And we've learned that if you cannot, you need to be able to share and talk about the vision in such a way that the other people want to join and be part of it. So that's why we've used these 3 terms. Elimination is asking plastic packaging users to look at the portfolio and remove plastic components, elements, or entire packaging that are problematic or unnecessary. unnecessary or problematic often means they are either littered easily or they're difficult to recycle. On the innovation side, it's about focusing on either the packaging, perhaps even the product, or the business model. So there we talk about reuse, maybe refill. Think about a shampoo delivered in a solid format, so that the need for packaging changes because the product is different, the delivery mechanism is different. So that really an innovative element where you can think about, well, how can we reduce the need for packaging, or at least reduce the amount of pollution that comes out at the end, of course. And circulate is focusing on the more downstream element of ensuring the used materials are collected, sorted, and recycled, or in the case of reuse, collected, cleaned, and reused. Naturally, these three elements very strongly correlate, and one action in elimination has an impact in circulation. So that's of course to be seen in a holistic approach. Now, on the next slide, I try to give you an idea of how these three buckets of actions are translated into the responsibility or influence sphere of the actors within Spain. So they are translated, of course, within that. So if you look at the first element, you see plastic producers on the left-hand side. One of the 2025 targets they've set on, so these are the petrochemicals organizations. They said, okay, we're going to be increasing the production of recycled plastics into the market, so make it more widely available. When you look to the next step in the value chain, it's about packaging users. You recognize the words of elimination, innovation or reuse, and circulation. So it's all about shifting to reuse, ensuring that all of their plastic packaging are either reusable, recyclable, or compostable, and they increase their recycled content. If you go to the government side, similarly, you recognize those terms there as well, where the governments are asked to stimulate, incentivize, or create the opportunity for the value chain to do that same thing. So shifting to reuse, where Joran was just talking about how important that is, including more recycled content, or enabling the collection, sorting, and recycling. So those are the set of targets that are how they translate to the specific opportunity within the actor in the value chain. So that's the framework, that's the setup. So if we now look at, so what have you been able to realize in the last 2 years? And then I wanted to highlight these three things here. So concerted action is all behind driving this impact. Like I said in the beginning, if you have individual companies or maybe or municipalities and governments not acting together, understanding how to address the same problem in the same way, the effect probably will be less. So we've seen that same thing. So on the first hand, the mobilization has been quite powerful and successful. 25% of the plastic packaging that are used globally have now joined the global commitment, being companies or governments, and trying to address this solution through this vision of a circular economy. When we look at the second element here, this is what we've taken from the last year's progress report, where actually the year before that even, when we said, okay, if we look at the aggregate ambition level on including more recycled content, we see that amount of about 25% of recycled content amounts to these amounts of oil never being taken out of the ground every year, or 8 million of tons of carbon saved, which is about 1.7 cars off the road. So there is a very direct and tangible impact, you could argue, from having this concerted action throughout the value chain. And the last point I wanted to mention here is equally bringing these groups of organizations together, having the same definitions and same vision, allows us also to say, okay, what is needed? What's a critical element of the roadmap to deliver on the vision? And one of the things that everybody understands easily is like fixing the recycling, so to speak. So what, and specifically collecting and sorting. There's a huge amount of money needed to do that, but there's no business case. So thinking about a reliable, sustainable way to fund that, we've come to the conclusion that the only way to do that is through an expanded producer responsibility. So just last month, we've created a call for globally, so to speak, okay, that we recognize this is the only way and the necessary part of the solution to implement EPR mechanisms. And we've created a huge amount of support from it for business support, also from the likes of organizations that we know 2 years ago maybe were lobbying against it, have now said, okay, yeah, we recognize this is a necessary part. And that immediately gave a lot of positive feedback to governments to start drafting bills to actually enable this. So this is just an example of what you can do if you bring the value chain together. And then on the last point, indeed, we when we think about and that what Jorn's already said, when we reflect about the size of the problem and the progress made through the initiatives I just highlighted, we need to acknowledge that these voluntary initiatives are showing that the solutions are possible, but we need many more companies and governments to join this concerted fight against plastic pollution. So, and equally, we see there's growing support, public and private, for coming to agreement on the global scale to tackle this, and to support that call. The WWF and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have launched this business case, or published this business case, I should say, for treatment of plastic pollution, and there's a lot of support now being ramped up by businesses and governments. So we're hopeful that the lesson we've learned over the years can really make us jump right into an effective solution on the global scale. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, and let me hand it back to you now, Jorns.
Thank you so much, Gerald. That was really clear and very to the point and inspiring in the scale of impact that we're managing to achieve. I just have a couple more slides. I know, Tessa, we're running out of time, so I'll just be quick on this, but it's important when we talk about this progress that we have clear agreed indicators. And here, the ones that we show in this slide are just, of course, not exhaustive and just some ideas, but it is important that these are key levers that we've identified across the life cycle. It is important as well to agree on the clear definitions of these indicators and the ways that we measure them, we report them, etc. So I'm not going to insist on specific ones, but Gerald already mentioned some of the definitions that have been advanced in terms of what is recyclability, what is effective recycling, etc., etc. So we will jump from here, but it's important that there is already some agreement, some progress in agreeing on these indicators and definitions, but further standardization will be useful to make them to make these definitions and indicators accepted and used globally. And then as a conclusion, this slide summarizes some of what we have seen and some of what we consider could be useful key elements of what a life cycle approach to addressing marine litter and plastics pollution could look like. So starting from the scientific basis, the quantitative analysis, this life cycle approach provides the scientific basis and the quantitative analysis as well that is required to assess whether we're actually making progress on environmental aspects, but also socioeconomic metrics. Life cycle assessment also allows us to compare the sustainability of different alternatives and different solutions. And it's important to focus on those solutions that really are driving impact for the good. And for all of these, of course, we need to agree on ways of measuring, and we need these kind of standard methods and definitions. Secondly, on action plans, we have heard a lot about the need to convert things into concrete action plans that can work at regional and national level. And they are best informed with life cycle approaches through hotspots analysis. As we have seen, there is already methodology proposed for this. And we can then ensure with this that all the actors can actually implement their most relevant actions. So multi-stakeholder implementation can also be informed with this type of value chain and life cycle approach. The hotspots, when we analyze the hotspots, this can also help in setting global and national reduction targets for the most important key performance indicators to achieve this global vision. Progress towards such targets would be also then reported regularly using harmonized monitoring method and the agreed metrics and definitions as we were mentioning. It is important to have this on a regular basis, as Gerald was mentioning, because that really keeps everybody on their toes and really ready to advance together. The life cycle approach is also extremely important to inform finance solutions at all levels. So this is about ensuring that finance is channeled to the most sustainable solutions, and that finance stops flowing to those to the causes of the problem. So we see this, for instance, also in the extended producer responsibility schemes, where fees can be eco-modulated based on the problems that are introduced by specific types of applications over others. And finally, we have seen, for instance, existing initiatives, and certainly we have just seen now the new plastics economy, the plastic pacts. We have seen that these multi-stakeholder initiatives are already building on a life cycle approach, and these initiatives can be scaled up and used to complement other elements that already exist, like the PRS conventions, the regional Cs, which are targeting other aspects of the life cycle, more the end of life sometimes, or the most problematic plastic additives. So all of these are needed. So with this, and apologies for taking a bit longer, I want to thank you again for your attention and bring it back to Tessa for the rest of the moderation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jorens and Gerald, for these very rich and enlightening presentations. Indeed, we need to move on to the next part of our program, which is a series of examples of how different actors have been applying a life cycle approach. And participants, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A box, and if possible, also indicate to who you would like us to address this question. So we're very pleased to have with us today the government of Chile, who, as many of you may know, is among the leading governments in applying a life cycle approach to plastic pollution through a circular economy. Chile is one of the 20 governments globally that have signed up to the new plastics economy global commitment that we just heard about, and also annually reports on its progress. So I'm very honored that we have with us Guillermo González Caballero, head of the circular economy of the Ministry of Environment of Chile, to tell us more about this. And Guillermo, many thanks for joining us today at this very early hour for you as well. So the Chilean government has made strong commitments in many key points of the plastics life cycle within the new plastics economy global commitment. And Guillermo, could you please tell us what you're doing to implement these?
Thank you, Tessa, and hello everyone who's connected here today. Actually, I'm seeing dawn in Santiago, Chile right now. It's very early morning. And it's a pleasure to share with you a little bit of what we have been doing around plastics from this life cycle assessment approach. And before getting specifically into plastics, just say one more general note on life cycle approach. A few weeks ago, we got the approval of our National Circular Economy Roadmap, where one of the key objectives is to promote life cycle assessment across the different sectors. And we have several actions there to do that by improving implementation and by generating incentives for different industries to doing so. But now when we get into plastics, of course, Chile is not removed from the global from the global experience now, in the sense that only 4.4% of plastics are circular today, according to our estimates. And so that's what led us to sign the global commitment back in October of 2018. And it's been really a great framework for us to actually see what we should be doing on this issue. The eliminate, innovate, and circulate framework has been extremely powerful, as I'll tell you a little bit more now. In 2019, we went on to launch the third Plastics Pact in the world after the UK and France. The Chilean Plastic Pact convenes the leading companies across the value chain, plus many other actors from municipalities, from civil society, and just as in all the other plastic pacts, we got to 4 specific, concrete, measurable targets. Most notably, the target to this commitment from the companies that are part of the pact, that 100% of their products or of their plastic products will be either reusable, recyclable, or compostable by the year 2025. But beyond the plastic pacts, we've also been moving towards concrete actions in these three areas. So in terms of eliminating, we back in 2018 also we banned plastic bags. That was a major breakthrough in the sense that what we saw is that people were really wanting to be part of this transformation. It got chosen as the most popular law of the year 2018 of all policy areas, which is really amazing, and that led us to move into a second law, a single-use plastic law that was approved by Congress a few weeks ago. And basically in this second bill, we are tackling most single-use plastics from the fast food industry. And then one thing that we learned after the banning of plastic bags, and that we learned from the studies, from the life cycle assessment studies, is that Lorenz mentioned this before. It's not necessarily a good idea to just move from plastic to another material, because when you look at it from a life cycle assessment, all those other materials also have their impacts. And in that sense, what we did in this second law is to say, okay, if you are going to, if you have a fast food restaurant, and if you are going to have consumers eating on inside the restaurant, everything on that tray, all the products need to be reusable. Not only moving away from plastics, but moving away from disposable items of any material, which is another major breakthrough there. So I would say that's a really relevant issue around eliminating. So when we move into innovate, besides what I already mentioned from the Plastics Pact, we included several incentives or several measures to incentivize innovation in our extended producer responsibility scheme. For instance, something that was just mentioned, eco-modulation of the fees, right? Which means that if you have a product that is not recyclable, then you have to pay more to the producer responsibility organization as a way to incentivize companies to move away from non-recyclable products. In the same single-use plastic law that I mentioned before, one other thing that we're saying is that when in this fast food restaurant there is a takeaway or a delivery of the meal, of course it's very difficult to have reusable products there. But what we say is that if you want to use plastic, then that plastic needs to be compostable. And that's because all of these plastics are going to be contaminated with organic material. And in that sense, we thought compostability was the way to go in this case. And then finally, when we think about the circulate, just as Gerald just mentioned now, the way to go, and that's what we have been doing here, is extended producer responsibility obligations, and that will allow Chile to have a recycling truck going through households, the doing door-to-door collection for packaging generally, but of course including plastics, in all urban areas. This is not something that will happen overnight. This is a 12-year process that we will start in the year 2023. But what we will see is producers funding and producers organizing door-to-door collection for packaging in all urban areas of our country, covering 80% of our population. I'll stop there, Tessa. That's just a very brief overview of all the things that we've been doing around plastics. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Guillermo, for your leadership on this matter, and also for sharing your experiences and insights on this. We will now move then to a collaborative initiative that aims at creating a circular economy for plastics packaging in South Africa. I'm talking about the recently launched South African Plastics Pact. Deshanya Naidu, thank you very much for joining us today and representing the South African Plastics Pact. Could you please tell us more about the Pact and how the life cycle approach is used in this context? And while doing so, can you perhaps also highlight any specific challenges that you have encountered when implementing this approach in support of decisions to move a more systemic way of dealing with plastic pollution?
Yes, great. Thank you so much for having us today. The South African Plastics Pact is, as you mentioned, a member of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Global Plastics Pact Network with 4 targets destined to create a circular economy for plastics. I'm just going to start off by going through a quick overview of our targets before going into the examples. The Plastics Pact model allows for collaboration across the plastics value chain, allowing for an inherently systemic and life cycle approach, considering the sources of plastics and associated impacts for our specific applications. Target 1 is taking action on problematic or unnecessary plastic packaging. Target 2 looks at the design for recycling, compostability, and recycled content, as well as looking at refill and reuse models. And our Target 3 and 4 looking at the use phase, maintaining the highest material value and reducing the impacts at the end of life through efficiently circulating plastics through closed or open loop recycling. How are we using a life cycle approach to create a circular economy for plastics? Well, under the South African Plastics Pact roadmap, various actions have been completed and scheduled to work towards these targets. Under Target 1, our members are actively working towards the phasing out of problematic and unnecessary materials. There are various actions that can be taken to phase out these items, such as elimination, substitution, and the partial or complete removal. We work with our members to encourage a life cycle approach in designing out problematic packaging with substitute materials to ensure that there are no unintended consequences or further negative or environmental social impacts. Under Target 2, we have just secured funding to perform a benchmark life cycle assessment study on a specific refill model in place in the South African market. We are currently defining the scope, the specific data usage, and the allocation of impacts, such that this will be a benchmark life cycle assessment against which other refill models in South Africa can be compared. This will be a breakthrough study to inform businesses going forward, as we currently do not have South African-specific LCAs based on refill models. Reuse models in South Africa are often criticized, claiming that they can be more resource-intensive than single-use plastic packaging in our context. As you are aware, South Africa is a cost-sensitive market, which is why we believe that reuse models have a role to play, as they have the potential to supply the specific amount a consumer requires at a time, and possibly at a lower price than the product would be if sold in single-use packaging. This will benefit the bulk of consumers in South Africa. You can go to the next slide, thank you. Under Target 3, we have our extended producer responsibility regulations that see South Africa as LCA as a necessary application to develop an EPR system that encourages producers and brand owners to make important design decisions upstream to not only ensure collection and material at the end of life, but to encourage design that allows for the packaging's next life cycle. The Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment has included in our mandatory EPR regulations that producers and PROs are required to conduct life cycle assessments on packaging placed on the market. This aims to design eco-modulation of the EPR fees and guide our brand owners in the selection of packaging for circularity and minimum impact. At present, we are facilitating conversations between the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment and LCA experts in South Africa. The recommended guidelines for the development of LCA in South Africa include product categories and product category rules, allocation methods and indicators, as well as data sources being defined and prescribed, and that the end-of-life cycle system boundaries and specific guidance on social LCA parameters be provided. You can go to the next slide. How are we going to move forward? Well, a life cycle approach is imperative for South Africa to support a systemic approach to ending plastic pollution. However, South Africa is part of a global system, and a global UN treaty for plastic pollution is necessary to address the circulation and impact of plastics, as well as provide global overarching guidance that's necessary to define system boundaries, the allocation of impacts, and the inclusion of litter into LCAs, with the persistence of plastics in the environment. Another very important point that I'd like to address going forward, as we go forward and dabble in alternative business models, is the support for a just materials transition that creates, secures, and sustains jobs. Thank you so much for your time, and if you have any further questions, please pop them into the chat or feel free to link with me.
Thank you so much, Deshanya, for this wonderful contribution to the event today, and also for your suggestions looking forward in what direction to go next. And now let's then turn to industry. We've heard from the many discussion forums that active participation from industry must be part of the solution to marine litter and plastic pollution. And today we have with us Tom Zaki, CEO of TerraCycle and Loop, one of the trailblazers globally in bringing reuse schemes to grocery products. Welcome, Tom.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And I'm going to leave my video on, as we are going to have a little chat, and I have a few questions for you. So maybe first, Tom, we heard that life cycle analysis studies can really help and suggest that reuse models may bring significant environmental benefits. How do you assess these benefits in Loop?
Absolutely. I'm going to share some visuals to share with you how we look at the life cycle analysis on a platform like Loop. Now, for anyone who may not know, Loop is a global platform for reuse, where we work with consumer product companies to enable reusable versions of their products. You know, those examples would look, say, something like this in laundry detergent, all the way to something like this in food. Now, from an LCA or life cycle analysis point of view, what's really important is to compare what is the current disposable or single-use package form, and how does that change when you think about reusable? So first and foremost, when we think about single-use or disposable packages, every time you buy that package, you have the same impact. So you get a linear LCA effect. And then if the package is heavier and less recyclable or otherwise inoptimal, the impacts go up. And inversely, if they are more recyclable or lighter, the impacts go down. But it's the same impact on every purchase. Now, what's interesting in a reuse ecosystem, you don't get a line, you get a curve. In other words, the cost of making that durable package is divided by the total number of uses. And so you get a curve effect, and it curves to the asymptotic line, which is really what is left after you divide out the cost of making the package, which is transporting and cleaning or resetting, if you will, the package. And so we see in reuse models 3 different scenarios of when the line and the curve, line for disposable and curve for reusable, intersect. The most common is where you are changing the package form. Here, moving from, say, a plastic shampoo bottle in disposable to an aluminum shampoo bottle in reusable. As you can see, the reusable is worse on the first use because it's made from aluminum versus plastic, a more costly material. But by the third use, they become equal, and then the reusable surpasses. Now, there are cases where package forms are the same. Say if you're moving from a glass bottle of olive oil in disposable to the same bottle being used, but now having a reuse waste management backbone to it. So it's the same package, but an upgraded end of life. There you'll see the same impact on the first use, because if you only use it once, it's identical and then immediately gets better. And of course, important to note that there are scenarios where reuse is not optimal. This is a hyperbole, but if you move from a very optimal disposable package to a very inoptimal reusable, the reusable may never be better. So it's important to always think about science-based LCA evidence for when to shift from disposable to reusable. And the most important is to understand how many reuses you need to do before you are creating an advantage over disposable. And will your system facilitate that amount of reuses to occur?
Great, thanks so much. And what do you see as the main hurdles for reuse models that global action can help resolve?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, the biggest challenge by far is, I think, synonymous with what is the challenge in shifting to an overall circular economy is not the environmental or consumer demand. I mean, those are pretty clear. it's the business logic. Disposable consumption is extremely profitable, and it's also a well-oiled machine. So reuse is a newer ecosystem, and it's comparing a baby learning to walk with a Olympic athlete who is running as fast as it possibly can. And so what is really needed to allow reuse models to scale quicker and be bigger is effectively financial support to allow them to compete with disposable ecosystems. So that could be negatives to disposable, making disposable consumption more expensive, or banning it in some cases, or inversely, on the positive side, making reusable consumption subsidized, making it cheaper to compete, because for the consumer is still primarily motivated by convenience and features and benefits and price points. And only for some is sustainability a valid feature and benefit. And so we have to accept that pragmatic point of view and effectively give a financial crutch or a financial crutch to reusability, or a disincentive to disposability.
And what advantage would be in there, for example, for the most proactive industries, like perhaps your own?
Yeah, I think the benefit is that as we transition, to a circular economy, many organizations have said that these are, massive financial opportunities, trillion-dollar opportunities, whether you think in energy, in products, and so on. And so clearly, the people who are going to be leading this transition are going to be higher chances of gaining those benefits. But we also have to, be very eyes wide open that in any transition, even though there's a big opportunity, there's going to be losers in the process, right? There's going to be the organizations that are left behind, maybe that are in the business of disposable, and we have to be eyes wide open there to think about how we can facilitate partnerships and transition to allow this to occur as smoothly as possible.
Thanks very much. And now we are a bit short of time, but in 1 minute, is there anything else that you would like to briefly bring to our attention, or the attention of the audience, that you think is very relevant to the applying the life cycle approach?
Well, so I think the biggest topic that we have to address, and we haven't talked about it as of yet, which is why I'll raise it here, is that it is important to think about from an LCA point of view, how do we decrease, the consumption, the impact per transaction unit, that we have. But I don't think anything that I've spoken about or any of my colleagues here have spoken about is fundamentally the answer until we modulate down total volume, right? So if we think about from an LCA point of view, we're talking about how to make our impact go down, 20, 30%. But if we keep consuming at that volume, that reduction of impact will be meaningless. The biggest thing we have to focus on is to reduce the multiplier, how many times we purchase, how much we purchase. And the exciting aspect of reducing that is that we can then have inoptimal systems that are in balance with the world as long as we don't consume as much of them. So we can eat meat, but let's eat it once a month instead of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then we don't have to ask everyone to shift into something that culturally may be more challenging. And that's just a metaphor on, on one example of consumption. But in all cases, the only solution to our environmental issues is to purchase less stuff.
Great. Tom, thanks very, very much for sharing your insight. Please keep your video on, because we have come to the question and answer session. I also would like to invite the other speakers to put on their video. And then let me perhaps turn for a first question to Gerald. Gerald, in the consideration of the targets, are also more long-term targets included? And if I may, I also would like to connect this to another question, which is directly actually linked to the SDG targets. On the scientific basis, what is the role of the SDG 12 indicators playing in this, or what is needed to make them useful in your work, for example, disaggregation and so on? Any thoughts on that, Gerald?
Sure, thanks. So longer term, so I think what I said in the beginning, when we launched the new plastic economy and a little bit later the global commitment, we set it against the 2025 timeline, not to be on the impression that we have then solved the challenge, but more as a first like that. But back then it was 10 years from when we started. It was okay, we wanted to meaningfully have an impact or change the statistics on how the industry and the world, for that matter, uses the material plastics. So yeah, we're already thinking about, okay, what's beyond 2025? We don't have an answer yet, but for sure we will have to be addressing many more other challenges. So I think we're just raising towards 25, showing that, you know, the first solutions, the first lowest hanging fruit can be addressed and adopted. And to Tom's point, you know, showing that reuse is manageable, possible, and is a great part of the solution. On the SDGs, I guess how we maybe. We don't have a direct connection in terms of like what the global commitment and the SDG, how they interrelate. I think on the more holistic perspective, we recognize circular economy as one of the solutions to address some of the bigger societal global challenges, including climate change, biodiversity loss. So you know, the responsible consumption and everything else is part of that's overarching ambition that we have. And I think the circular economy is one of the ways to address those solutions and understand how we, in a very localized approach, can identify the solutions there.
Thanks very much, Gerald. I also have a question for you, Jorens. Now, earlier you mentioned that you also look at related issues in the life cycle analysis. And how do you address things like health effects, for example, from toxins? And a bit related to that, also the question, what happens actually with the additives of plastics when you kind of look at the whole aspects of the life cycle?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. And so life cycle assessment assesses almost all types of environmental issues, and including issues related to toxicity. Now, this is probably one of the most challenging impact categories, and assessing the toxicity of substances which are related to plastics. Well, we have many different challenges there. On the one hand, very little is known of the additives that actually are in plastics, and when you're talking about plastics at the end of life, and they come from all sorts of uses, the challenge is even bigger. And then, of course, modeling the potential impacts from those additives depends as well on so many other things, such as the type of waste treatment and the type of technology, on whether these substances will actually become to pose a risk to human health. So the answer would be yes, it is taken into account. No, it's not simple at all, and certainly we need much more information. And obviously, I mean, one key aspect would be, well, if those additives which are most problematic and challenging are avoided to begin with, that's what will facilitate, well, certainly the assessment, but also it will reduce their impacts. So I hope that at least addresses partly the question.
Thanks very much, Jorens. I also have a question for Guillermo here. Guillermo, do you think you will need to create your own compostable certification as the ISO standards are not so effective? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So as I mentioned, in our single-use plastic law, what we required is for takeaway products, if they want to use plastic, if those businesses want to use plastic, they can only use compostable plastics. And in the same law, what it says is that we will need to create a national certification for that. Of course, we're going to be taking up the experience of the international standards, but we are in the process of generating a local standard for compostability for those plastics, which is key, right? Because the last thing we want to see happening is to have compostable plastics that are not really compostable, or that are, say, oxo biodegradable, and that will end up in the organic streams, and then what we will get in soils is loads of microplastics. That would be a major problem, and we certainly want to avoid that through.
I have another comment in the chat, and perhaps Deshanya, you would like to consider this one. So Jorens was talking about 3 types of action to build circular economy for plastics, such as eliminate, innovate, and circulate. And actually many of you did. So there is no mention here of education and sensitization. is it the case that education and sensitization have no significant role to play in the battle against plastic pollution? That, in the view of the person asking the question, is actually the #1 action. What are your thoughts on this, Desanya?
No, I think that's definitely not the case. And I mean, it's a bit weird that none of us actually mentioned it, but it's a very good point in that education is absolutely pivotal, not only for the consumer, but to actually be able to disseminate this knowledge in a way that can be digested by anyone. And I think that in the South African Plastics Pact, we've spent a lot of time on consumer communication and plan to spend a lot of time on it in the future, and that we have consumer communications campaigns that have been going out, as well as looking at how we can make our on-pack label recycling within our pack membership more digestible. And it's not always as easy as, you know, taking out your phone and scanning it to be able to see what would happen to your product at the end of its life cycle, because that's not actually possible for everyone. So it is definitely the case where we need to look at how can we make this information available to everyone and also understandable to everyone. And I think that's definitely one of the most vital components we can look at going into the future.
Yeah, thanks very much for your comment and answer on this. I also have a specific question here on what you would propose for small island states where importation of single-use plastics is common, and the only option is to landfill them because a 3R system is actually limited. Anyone from the panel who would like to comment on this? I understand Tom has a slight connection issue, so I will not turn to him with the questions directed to him. But anyone who would like to take this question from the panel?
I mean, maybe I can
Lorenz?
give it a go if that's okay. But certainly that's a specific challenge. I think, however, we're used to work on the kind of the business as usual, in which well, we have been exporting single-use plastic products and other problematic items to small island states. I think we have to reconsider whether these are the best type of products that can work in these conditions, and certainly try and find which would be the models in which products can work in a more effective way. Because landfilling is definitely not an option. It's not the solution. There's not the space in small islands, but also it tends to generate further problems down the line. So if this is not an option, I think we just need to get creative on how do we make other options work. If they are still single-use products which need to be recycled, how can they actually be taken out just as they are taken into the island? And if they are different types of products, like if we're shifting to reusable, but perhaps also need the economies of scale, how do we ensure that there is this transportation in and out? So solving the reverse logistics is always complicated. However, the option to continue as we are today, it's not an option, should not be an option either. So I think we need to get certainly very creative on that front. It is a challenge, but it needs to be solved. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wanted to chip in, Jorens. I was thinking, I also don't have a very concrete answer, but I do know that if you think about, you know, the systemic changes or the solutions needed, what could be new business models and reuse and refill and what have you. If you think about the stage where we're in, there's predominantly a lot of pilots being happening. A lot of people wanting to test, like, you know, what's the consumer uptake, what is the regulatory context, how does the material behave, or the packaging itself, etc. So potentially, such an island state, which is a confined community, you could argue, is a good place to try and test some of those those models and new ideas. So that potentially, if you can find the organization who want to collaborate with you and find the societal support, then maybe that's an opportunity as well.
Thanks very much. And Desanya, I have another question for you. What advice or tips would you give the youth of South Africa in terms of trying to get as many people aware of the issue of plastics pollution and the importance of reusable products? What can the youth do? What can individuals do to help get businesses and people on this path?
Well, I think that from what we've seen so far and collaborating with different stakeholders is that you can't actually underestimate the impact of one person looking to make a change. That person can always start a systemic change, no matter how big or small they are. But I always think that, I mean, education, of course, is very important, and it's something that should definitely be promoted in terms of letting everyone really understand the actual resource consumption of your different packaging or food items that you are consuming on a day-to-day basis. But, you know, it starts with small steps before you go on to make a systemic change. And there's always a small step that can be done, whether it's separation at source in your own home or getting your neighbors to do it, or looking at how you can start to shift the system. You know, you don't have to see it as a huge, like monstrous task that needs to start. Start with something small and spread it to those around you.
Great, thank you so much. And then Guillermo, last but not least, let me put this question to you. Can all common types of single-use plastics be recycled? For example, cutlery, straws, styrofoam, takeout boxes, coffee cups, bags, bottles, masks. Or is the approach not to recycle those and simply refuse? Your thoughts on this, last but not least.
Oh yes, sure, and that's what I mentioned during the presentation. That's refusing those, eliminating those items is what we are going for. The single-use plastic law that that was approved a few weeks ago in Congress basically says that we have to realize, we have to accept, we have to admit that those kinds of plastics, I mean, cutlery contaminated with mayonnaise is very difficult in practice to be recycled, you know. And in that sense, we say, okay, if you're gonna be eating inside the restaurant, then that piece of cutlery needs to be reusable, right? And we do not think recyclability is a solution for everything, just as we think composability is not a solution to everything. For instance, now there is another bill in Congress that was introduced by some congressmen, and they say that political ads in the street, they need to be compostable. And we're like, why would that need to be compostable? It's nonsense, you know. Whereas it's very different when you have some material, some plastic material contaminated with food that can go into the food stream, you know. And so these solutions are not, there's no silver bullet here. This is a very complex problem, and we need tailored solutions for each specific area that we are tackling.
Thank you very, very much. And with that, we have actually come to the end of the question and answer session. Many thanks to everyone for your insightful questions. I know there are a couple of more, and I think the team behind the screens will still help answer some of these. And also many thanks to all of you, esteemed panelists for today, for your comments and answers. It was a real privilege for me to moderate this lively session. I know we had about 720 registered participants for this event. So it's now my great pleasure to hand over the floor to my UNEP colleague, Elisa Tonda, head of the Consumption and Production Unit, to provide some closing remarks. Elisa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. And let me start from where you left by thanking really very much all the panelists for their very enriching intervention. Thanking you, Tessa, for the excellent moderation and for keeping us on time. And also I'm going to add a special thank to all the UNEP colleagues that you have not seen on screen, but who have made this event possible. And I conclude my thanks by thanking really each and every one of you for having connected to this session and for having had such a lively discussion with us, with the speakers. And let me try and wrap up some of the messages that I have heard in the course of the session. So we've been concentrating on a life cycle approach that will help us as a strong scientific and quantitative basis for decisions that will help us understand whether the actions that we're taking are really shifted the needle in addressing plastic pollution and are really taking us in the right direction, in the direction that we want to go to. At the beginning of the session, we have gone through a very generic description of what a life cycle approach is, and I'll use this also as an entry for the conclusions. A life cycle approach ensures the identification of key hotspots in the production and in the consumption system. And these are identified by considering all potential impacts on climate, on ecosystem, on toxicity, on jobs, on the economy, impacts that are caused by plastic products and their alternatives in each stage of the life cycle, from the extraction of raw material, the processing of secondary material, to product manufacture, distribution, maintenance and use, and end of life management. And this information, the life cycle approach, can help us orient our decision towards the best solution for the environment and keeping into consideration socio-economic implications. We've also flagged in several interventions the fact that in order to apply consistently a life cycle approach, we need a strong scientific foundation of common definition, common methodologies, commonly agreed and accepted guidelines, indicators that allow us to uniformly apply a life cycle approach. And we've also seen throughout the session what are the results of applying a life cycle approach to handle global plastic pollution. We have seen that using life cycle approach, we are in a possibility to compare alternatives from a life cycle perspective. We have seen that we could use a life cycle approach to orient some of our economic decisions. We have seen that in a number of instances, this is applied, for example, to eco-modulated fees in extended producer responsibility schemes, so that payments are differentiated on the basis of recyclability or non-recyclability of products, but also that they can inform investment decisions by financiers towards the desired solutions and business practices. We have seen how life cycle approach can help us identify hotspots around which we could design national and regional action plans that keep into account a full life cycle perspective. And we've also seen and discussed in a number of instances that they allow us to identify quantifiable reduction targets that help us understand how we're moving ahead towards our common vision and our common goals. And in doing that, they also help us bring together all the different actors of the plastic value chain and give clarity of the role that they can play towards this common vision. And we've also seen that a life cycle approach is the basis of already existing, already operational global initiatives. Some of them were mentioned during the intervention, such as the New Plastic Economy Global Commitment, the Plastic Pacts, the Global Tourism Plastic Initiative. A number of reflections have also pointed us to the fact that while currently the application of life cycle approaches gives us a sense of what we can do today through voluntary approaches and what are the possibilities going forward, it is definitely needed that a more systemic action is taken on board. And this could allow us to, for example, tackle some of the challenges that the speakers brought to the table. For example, around business models that are currently not necessarily the most cost-effective options, and this was referred to while presenting some of the experiences of our speakers in applying reuse models. But it also enables us to think through how we can change our approach towards addressing global plastic pollution, not only by focusing on the impact of specific products, but also while looking at opportunities associated with reducing volumes. One point that was also very interestingly raised in the context of the discussion is the importance of making sure that information that emerge from the application of life cycle approaches are transformed in such a way that they are available, understandable, easy to communicate to all, so that we can ensure that we raise the awareness of all the actors that we need to have on board to address the challenge of plastic pollution. And let me just conclude by reiterating that all of us, and I'm sure I can say also of our partners, are really committed to continue support all stakeholders in applying scientific life cycle based approach to address plastic pollution, but also to use this experience to address all types of pollution and steering our economy towards climate stability, nature recovery, and a pollution-free planet. And I conclude here by thanking you all again for having stayed online with us until now, and wishing all of you a very nice continuation of the day wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for having joined us.